So, do immigrants steal jobs from native workers? This is a huge question when it comes to economics and immigration. It is arguably the biggest question, and setting the record straight on this one is critical because this seems to affect the way people vote and people's fears so much. Now, let me start with the misconception. There is a very strong misconception that, say there's 100 workers wherever you live, and all of a sudden you have 100 immigrants that move in. It's very common, in fact, it seems common sense to believe that all of a sudden there's more competition for jobs and wages. And so what's going to happen? Some of those immigrants are going to steal jobs from native workers, and the wages of those who are lucky enough to keep their jobs are going to go down because there's more wage competition. This comes from very bad economic models that people have in their head. There's no other way to put it. The evidence, by the way, is very clear, especially in the last decade. The evidence has been very clear that that does not happen on average. It happens in some exceptional circumstances, but on average, the headline is that does not happen. Now, this misconception comes from two sources. One is that people have, as I said, a very bad lay model of supply and demand. They think, well, obviously, if the supply of workers doubles from 100 to 200 in my example, there's going to be more competition. Okay. But that ignores demand, right? That's only a supply argument. The supply of workers is increasing, but also the demand for all kinds of things in the economy is increasing, because if you have 200 people in that economy, you now have more people that demand housing, entertainment, food, etc., and you need more people working to meet that demand. And so that's why studies show that immigrants, on average, again, are not taking jobs away and are not lowering the wages of natives. But there's another really problematic assumption in this lay model of supply and demand. And that assumption is that a native worker and an immigrant worker are identical. They're interchangeable. So a company can hire, one or the other, and therefore they're in direct competition with each other. That is just simply not the case. Evidence shows that immigrants are different in good ways, in ways that actually create jobs for native workers rather than take them away. One of the very obvious ways is that immigrants simply want and do different jobs than natives. In the United States, for example, overwhelmingly farm work, household service work, construction work, a lot of manufacturing work is done by immigrants and not natives. Natives simply do not want to do that work. Even if you increase wages somewhat, natives will not do it. Now, of course, increase them within reason, right? If you offer me $1 million to do construction work, I'll do it. But of course, that's not a reasonable wage for construction work. But within normal wage bands, immigrants do work that natives simply don't want to do. But even in sectors of the economy where immigrants and natives work in the same sector, they play different roles. Immigrants play to their strengths and natives play to their strengths. The best example I can think of is a restaurant, right? In a restaurant, you often see native workers that work as the wait staff. Why? Because they speak the language well. And you see immigrant workers in the kitchen or washing the dishes because they don't have the advantage of knowing the language. So immigrants and natives sort into roles and functions that play to their different strengths. So when you put those two things together, that the economic pie is growing because demand is increasing, and that immigrants and natives aren't competing for the same jobs and positions, that's how you explain that immigrants don't take jobs and don't lower the wages of natives. In fact, there's even good news when you start to realize that immigrants and natives are different from each other. It turns out that immigrants help natives increase their earnings, and here's how. Let's say that there's a construction company, right? And all of a sudden, the construction company can hire immigrant workers to do the truly manual labor that requires no language skills. Where's the opportunity for a native worker? All of a sudden, the native worker can apply for the position to be the foreman or something like that, and they're going to get paid a little bit more by taking that position. That's why we actually have evidence by economists like Giovanni Perry and others that show that in places where there's more immigrants, more unskilled immigrants, native workers' wages go up precisely because for that reason, because the immigrants take sort of the bottom of the ladder positions. That's their kind of entry point into the American dream, and it kind of pushes natives up the earnings ladder a little bit. Okay, and that's a win-win instead of a win-lose. Now, I said there's another reason why this misconception is very common, and that's because for a few years, especially in the 90s, there were some very famous studies that seemed to show that immigrants were lowering the wages of natives, especially natives that didn't have a lot of education. Those studies, they were, reasonable studies for the time, but since then we've just had much better data and much better evidence that has debunked those studies. And in fact, the best evidence, the most recent evidence shows the opposite, that when immigrants arrive, natives have more jobs and their wages go up. So we actually, can trust the best evidence, the most recent evidence to say that you need not be worried about the danger that immigrants cause to native workers. That's the bottom line. Now, I want to just warn you about something. Some of you are going to watch this and not believe me. Some of you are going to watch this and say, but wait a minute, there's some, economist or some famous person that is saying the opposite, some journalist at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Those journalists and economists are basing their conclusions on research that is outdated, research from the 1990s, maybe early 2000s that has been debunked. I'm giving you sort of the state of the art, and don't believe me, go to the sources, go to all the research studies that I'm linking in this page, read them for yourself, and I think you'll see that I'm making a fair summary of what the evidence tells.